This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good evening. We're coming on the air a bit earlier than usual because of breaking news at this hour. A grand jury here in New York City has just handed up an indictment against former President Donald Trump, making him the first former president in U.S. history to face criminal charges. This, of course, is unprecedented. The former president accused of paying $130,000 in hush money to Stormy Daniels in the weeks before the 2016 presidential election. Again, the news just coming in moments ago, according to multiple sources, the Manhattan grand jury votes to indict Donald Trump. I want to bring in our investigative reporter, Aaron Katursky, in Lower Manhattan tonight. Aaron, what have you learned?
Word came down just a short while ago, David, that a grand jury that has been meeting here since January has just voted to return an indictment against former President Trump. The indictment is currently under seal, so we don't know the specific charges, but the grand jury had been hearing evidence about Trump's alleged role in that hush payment you mentioned to Stormy Daniels. Hush money by itself is not illegal. It's the way that Trump and the Trump organization accounted for it that got the attention of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which called more than a half dozen witnesses over the last several weeks, including Michael Cohen, former President Trump's one-time fixer and attorney who wrote the $130,000 check to Stormy Daniels and said in congressional testimony and during court activity that he was directed by Trump to make that payment in order to protect Trump's election chances in 2016. We don't, again, know the specific charges because this is under seal, but falsifying business records, David, is a misdemeanor in New York. It can be bumped up to a felony if the business records were falsified in furtherance of another crime. What that crime could be, perhaps a campaign finance violation, perhaps a violation of state election law or tax law. We just don't know, but it's always been thought, David, the Manhattan District Attorney would not move forward with this unprecedented indictment of a former American president unless there were going to be felony charges.
Aaron Katursky in Lower Manhattan tonight. We hear the helicopters, the news choppers overhead as this Manhattan grand jury votes to indict former President Donald Trump. Of course, as I mentioned at the top here, unprecedented. The first time we have seen this in history, a former president being indicted. I want to bring in ABC News legal analyst Kate Shaw to pick up, Kate, where Aaron left off there. We know that the indictment has been handed up. We simply don't know what the charges are, though, yet. We know the prosecutors in this case have zeroed in on this hush money payment, the falsification of records, and potentially whether or not this could have been an elections campaign violation as well. That is somewhat untested, is it not?
That's right, David. So exactly as Aaron just said, this crime of falsifying business records with an intent to defraud, standing alone is a misdemeanor. But if it is done in furtherance of or in an effort to conceal another crime, it is bumped up to a felony, far more serious, longer statute of limitations, longer potential penalties. But of course, the big question is what that other crime could be. A campaign finance crime, as you said, David, this would be somewhat uncharted because there have been no charges against former President Trump for any violation of campaign finance laws. So this would be bootstrapping this state charge potentially to an uncharged federal crime. That's a possibility. But of course, there are other possibilities, maybe a state tax crime that could be the offense that could bump this up from a misdemeanor to a felony. So, of course, once the indictment is unsealed, we'll be able to take a look and evaluate what the legal theory really looks like.
Once this indictment is unsealed, and Kate, what's your best guess here as to how long the American people will wait before they hear what the charges are here?
I think it'll happen pretty quickly, Aaron. And of course, the next step would be either a voluntary surrender or an arrest. You have to imagine a voluntary surrender as how this is likely to proceed. But an arrest is typically what follows an indictment and then an arraignment. There are no special procedures under the law for a former president, but often accommodations are made. So we will see what all of those steps look like, but that's typically the sequence of events that follows an indictment.
So potentially we could see what's in this indictment within days here.
I think that's very possible, David.
All right, Kate Shaw with us here. Kate, thank you for helping us to navigate what is, as I mentioned, an historic moment. I want to bring in John Carl, who has covered Donald Trump, the former president, for many years. And John, Kate alluded to this, but we will see something we have never seen before. How it looks, how it unfolds, there are many questions still. How they'll bring the former president to New York, what that will look like, if we see much of it at all. But what's your understanding as to the possibilities of what the American public will see here as a former president is now indicted?
First, David, I think it's important to say that we are in entirely uncharted territory here. Not only is Donald Trump the first former president to face indictment, he is also currently the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. And he is facing not just this indictment, but we know at least 3 other active criminal investigations, 2 of them federal investigations, one of them an investigation in Georgia. So he is facing further legal action as he is indicted here, and he has already made it clear that an indictment would not deter him from continuing to run for president. So this is something beyond anything that not only have we never seen anything like this in American history, it would have been hard to even imagine anything like this. In terms of what happens next, we know that the Secret Service has had conversations with law enforcement officials in New York about the logistics surrounding an appearance of Donald Trump before the court for an arraignment. He would need to come in for an arraignment. He need to go through booking and processing just like anybody else who would be facing criminal charges. Typically that includes basic things like fingerprinting and the taking of a mugshot. But as you can imagine, it would also necessitate massive security around that courthouse in Lower Manhattan, particularly because Donald Trump has repeatedly called his supporters to come out and protest this pending indictment. He predicted this indictment was coming. He had said it was going to come more than a week ago, and now it has come, and we will, of course, be watching very closely how Donald Trump communicates to his supporters and what kind of a reaction we'll see there. But yes, we expect this will be a voluntary appearance, that he would turn himself in, and that the handoff would be coordinated very closely with the Secret Service. He, of course, still has Secret Service protection as a former president.
The DA in this case, Mr. Bragg, obviously likely attempting to negotiate with the former president's team right now. John Carl talking about the possibility that they've been in touch with the Secret Service already to plan what could this look like potentially in the coming days as a former president would be brought to Manhattan. Obviously, they would try to come up with some sort of agreement. But John Carl, back to you on this. There's no guarantee here, because this is uncharted territory, of what the public is going to see here. Obviously, they'll take into account that this is a former president. We simply don't know whether we would see a walk in public, for example, that we would see in other cases if it weren't a former president. And we also don't know what happens once he's taken into the bowels of the courthouse to be fingerprinted, or what any other potential defendant would have to go through in a case like this.
We've seen countless other cases involving high-profile indictments of high-profile individuals, where you've seen what we've come to call the perp walk, where a candidate, walks in past the cameras, almost always handcuffed, and brought in to be arraigned. I think it is highly unlikely that Donald Trump would be, as a Secret Service protectee, would be handcuffed in a situation like this. There's also no guarantee that there would be that traditional perp walk in New York. That happens occasionally. We saw it happen with the longtime CFO of the Trump Organization when he was indicted within the past year. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen here. The other thing that we don't see as much as we used to, David, is mugshots. The mugshots are taken, but in New York anymore, not generally released. So we don't know. This is as we will say probably many times in the days ahead, a circumstance that we have never seen before. But Donald Trump is a criminal defendant now, and as a message you'll, I'm sure, hear from the district attorney in Manhattan, nobody is above the law, and he's going to have to go through the same basic proceedings that any other criminal defendant must go through.
John, stick with us here. I'm going to come back to you in the broader context of these other investigations that the former president still faces that are ongoing. But there's another breaking development in this. We know that Alvin Bragg's team at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has now informed the former president's team of this indictment. I want to bring back in Aaron Katersky again in Lower Manhattan. Aaron, what have you learned on this front?
As soon as the grand jury voted up the indictment, David, the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, and his team had an obligation to tell now the defendant, former President Trump, and his legal team about the indictment. Whether they told them the specific charges, we don't yet know. The indictment remains under seal, as is typical in New York, until a defendant appears for an arraignment on that indictment. But every white-collar defendant in New York is afforded the opportunity to turn himself in and present himself into court for an arraignment. So that's what we fully expect here. And whether the formal processing is going to take place that John Karl describes is still an open question. Donald Trump had a gun permit here in New York, so his fingerprints are on file. He's among the most photographed individuals in the world. So whether they need to take a formal mugshot, we're still waiting to find out. Not that it would be released here in New York, but David, as you've alluded to already, so much about this process, while it will go through some familiar steps, will be unprecedented because of the defendant involved. Already, though, today, one of our first signs that something was potentially happening with the grand jury was an increase in security, not just out here by court. This courthouse has been ringed in metal barricades ever since Trump went on social media to predict that he would be arrested. But inside these buildings as well, more officers, especially on sensitive floors where this matter has been discussed in recent days and weeks, David.
Aaron Katersky, our investigative reporter in Manhattan at this hour. I want to read a statement just in from Michael Cohen, the former attorney, friend, and fixer to the former President Donald Trump, obviously no longer friends, now a star witness in this case before the grand jury in New York. That grand jury handing up an indictment. The former president will face criminal charges now in this case. And Michael Cohen, in a statement just released, saying, for the first time in our country's history, a president of the United States, former or current, has been indicted. I take no pride in issuing this statement and wish to also remind everyone of the presumption of innocence as provided by the Due Process Clause. However, Michael Cohen goes on to say, I do take solace in validating the adage that no one is above the law, not even a former president. The two things I wish to say at this time is that accountability matters, and I stand by my testimony. I want to bring in reporter John Santucci, who works in our investigative unit as well. And John, you covered the Trump years very closely, the Trump campaign leading to his election in 2016. You know of this relationship between Michael Cohen, Donald Trump. What are you learning from inside Trump world at this hour? Their reaction so far?
David, stunned. I mean, this is something they certainly knew was coming, but as we've been reporting here on ABC News and as many other outlets have for the last couple of weeks, the Trump team thought they were going to get a little bit of a hiatus, a little bit of a break. So the calls are flying in Mar-a-Lago. Many people surprised by this, the fact that it happened today, but not surprised, David, in the fact that it actually did happen. This is probably the worst kept secret, if you will. Everyone has known just from witnesses that have gone in, both Trump allies and foes, you mentioned Michael Cohen there, that this was something coming soon to Donald Trump. Now, obviously, the question is what's going to happen next. We're told that the former president is about to issue a statement. They're working that out. We'll bring that to you as soon as we have it. But to John Karl's question and point earlier about the process for Donald Trump to come to New York, David, he wants to come to New York. Everything we have been told is that the former president wants this moment. And you heard Aaron Katersky there talking about mugshots. One of Trump's closest allies said to me over the weekend, please let there be a mugshot. We want to put it on a T-shirt. It'll be part of our campaign ensemble as we look to 2024. So as many people might think, and there's been some speculation Donald Trump was dreading this day, I think that's a little bit true, David. I mean, nobody wants to go to criminal court, but there is a part of Donald Trump that sees this as a big boon for his new presidential campaign.
He's going to try to use this as a political weapon, obviously, as John Karl has pointed out. John Santucci, our thanks to you. John Karl pointing out that he continues to run for president and is the front runner on the Republican side in so many of the polls. Rachel Scott, who is already covering the race for the White House, was in Waco, Texas, and heard firsthand at that rally how the former president has turned these investigations into an important part of his campaign message.
Exactly, David. He really leaned into his legal troubles at that rally in Waco, his first really major presidential rally of the 2024 presidential cycle. He called it the central issue of our time, the weaponization of our justice system. And he brushed off any concern about these investigations, dismissing them as a witch hunt, calling it one phony investigation after another. And David, we are starting to see some reaction coming from Republicans over on Capitol Hill. Congressman Jim Bakes from Indiana calling this political prosecution. Congressman Ralph Norman tweeting, "This isn't about justice or rule of law. It's just about optics of an indictment." We have not heard yet from House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, but in the lead up to a possible indictment, he was pressed about this repeatedly on Capitol Hill. He also dismissed this, saying that it was a political game being played, David.
Rachel Scott in Washington. Rachel, thank you. I want to bring in Stephanie Ramos at the White House. We know President Biden has not officially declared that he's running for re-election, though very much looks like the candidate, and told me that he does intend to run. Just hasn't officially announced it yet. Knows that he could very well face Donald Trump again in another matchup leading up to the 2024 election. And Stephanie, any reaction from the White House tonight to this indictment?
Not yet, David. The White House has not yet commented on this news. Overall, the White House has stayed largely away from commenting on this. When asked, they've said they will not weigh in on ongoing investigations. When asked if President Biden believed it was okay for someone who's been indicted to run for president, they've said that they could not engage because of the Hatch Act. Now, typically in a re-election year, you know this, David, it is common for someone to highlight the weaknesses of their opponent. But this is a tricky situation for President Biden, since anything he says on this case could have implications for any federal cases against former President Trump. Now, it could also be seen as political if the president were to be seen as celebrating Trump's indictment. But as far as the White House reacting to this news tonight, they have made no comment just yet.
Stephanie Ramos at the White House tonight. Stephanie, thank you. And for those of you who are just tuning in, many of you likely looking for your local news, we will be joining your local news shortly, but we continue to cover the breaking news at this hour. A Manhattan grand jury has handed up an indictment. That means former President Donald Trump will, in fact, be criminally charged in the hush money case. I do want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent, on two key questions moving forward here, Pierre. First of all, with relation to this case right here in New York, there have been calls for protests. We've heard that from the former president again. We've heard leaders really on both sides of the aisle say, in essence, do not protest. We are not going to see what we have seen in our country before. Even the Republican leader, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has urged people not to protest this decision if and when it comes. Now it has in fact come, but we know that there is stepped up security here in New York and beyond because of this.
Absolutely, David. Law enforcement officials, particularly at the federal level, have been loath to comment much at all about the situation unfolding in Manhattan. Suffice it to say, they are very aware of what happened on January 6th, and those statements by former President Trump about death and destruction did not go unnoticed. They have facts in the past that suggest that there might be people that would act out on behalf of the president, angry about what he is about to undertake. So law enforcement officials, I think we can expect to see in New York and other locations, including here in Washington, will be on alert. I know from sources that I've talked to that they've been really mining the intelligence, listening for information from that part of the world that generated to January 6th to see if there's anything specific. I was told last week, David, that they had uncovered no specific allegation of a direct threat of violence, but it's something they're very concerned about, David.
Now, on the second question for you, Pierre, the special counsel's investigation that is ongoing, obviously, as this investigation in New York was as well. Jack Smith looking into two separate cases here. Obviously, the events leading up and including January 6th, and also the discovery of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. We've seen indication in recent days that that investigation has in fact ramped up. So we're looking at this case and potentially two more investigations involving the special counsel and the investigation in Georgia. Absolutely. And I know from sources directly that one of the reasons why Merrick Garland chose Jack Smith is that he was known as being extremely aggressive. You've seen in recent weeks through the reporting of our investigative team that he's been pushing on the issue of executive privilege. He wants to get answers from the people closest to President Trump so that he can figure out what, if anything, he should do in terms of these cases. Now, I'm being told that the issue of fraud and the
fake electors is of high interest to Special Counsel Smith. Also, this whole issue of, how state officials were contacted, who was doing it on the president's behalf, what did he know about that? So that is very much being pursued aggressively. That said, they are keeping it totally separate from what's happening in the District of New York in terms of the Manhattan District Attorney, because they know that they cannot be seen as playing politics. It's something, David, that people here are particularly concerned about. So they're trying to do all their talking in court at present.
There had been so many questions, Pierre, or thanks to you, so many questions about whether there would be any sort of, not official coordination, but any coordination between these investigations. There had been some talk, as we heard from John Santucci earlier, that a decision to in fact vote this grand jury might be delayed until after perhaps the Easter holiday, that this would be weeks from now. Instead, word coming late this afternoon that the grand jury did vote this afternoon. They voted to indict the former president. Again, the history made as we now approach 6 o'clock here in the East, involving a former president. The first time a former president has been criminally charged in this country. And John Santucci, I want to bring it back to you because you've learned that the Secret Service has now been in touch with members of Trump's team.
Trump's team has made proactive calls to the Secret Service, David, trying to figure out what exactly this would look like. And it's twofold, right? It's the security around Mar-a-Lago. It is an island. It is a complex. There is only one bridge to get there. So that is concern number one. And then it's obviously the concern of getting him up to New York. Look, as Aaron was talking about earlier, bike racks, they are the new thing surrounding the DA's office in Lower Manhattan. I can tell you from just walking around Trump Tower in Midtown earlier this week, the racks are back, the cinder blocks are there. It looks as though it was the days when Donald Trump, frankly, had a different address at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But for the moment, we don't know when this trip would be to New York. We had heard weeks ago that it would be a process. It would be several days. We wouldn't expect to see Donald Trump in New York the day after word of an indictment. Obviously, we are checking that. We're not sure. But it's going to be a process to physically bring him here. And what does that look like as far as the courtroom? And you have to remember, too, David, though it would be Donald Trump's arraignment, there's other business in criminal court. There are other criminals, frankly, in criminal court. So actually sealing off the building for the former president's protection, as he is a Secret Service protectee, is going to be a high priority, both for the Secret Service and NYPD.
John Santucci with us here. Aaron Katersky, I want to go back to you down in Lower Manhattan. And Aaron, to get to John's point earlier about what this could look like, what are your sources inside the DA's office telling you about potentially what Americans would see unfold here when the former president is brought to Manhattan?
When that happens, David, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and former President Trump's legal team will have choreographed the whole thing, and those conversations will be ongoing. No arraignment date has yet been set, according to a court official I just spoke with, and he says that's going to be up to them, to the DA's office and to the former president's attorneys to negotiate. Once he is here, whether there's a camera in court, that's up to the judge in New York State Court, and that can be a game time decision, but everything that happens will undoubtedly be highly choreographed. We don't yet know what the charges are. Those will not be unsealed until Trump appears here at court. But we know the grand jury had been examining evidence of Trump's alleged role in falsifying business records of his company when, as Michael Cohen, his former fixer, has said, he accounted for the payment to Stormy Daniels as a routine legal expense. And prosecutors have been examining, and the grand jury's been examining, whether the true intent was not a routine legal expense, but to protect his campaign chances. Stormy Daniels alleged that she had an affair with Donald Trump back in 2010, which she has long denied, but she wasn't paid until the closing weeks of the 2016 presidential campaign. And Cohen has suggested that Trump was thinking about his election chances and nothing else. Trump has said that he was trying to protect his family from an extortion. So this is by no means an open and shut case, David, but the very first step will be to get Trump here for his arraignment, and no date has yet been set.
Very clear that it is not an open and shut case. In fact, it could very well be a difficult case to prosecute, Aaron, as you know, and to prosecute this on the state level and to potentially try to connect this to federal election law would be, again, something that's been untested so far.
It's never happened before to see whether a top charge of falsifying business records, ordinarily a misdemeanor, could be elevated to a felony based on a federal crime. That could be the legal theory. There could be other legal theories that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is working with. They have not said, and they're not commenting tonight, David.
Ken Nowday with us, an ABC News contributor as well, legal contributor, once worked in the DA's office. Our thanks to Aaron there. Aaron, thank you. We'll see you on World News Tonight a short time from now. In the meantime, Ken, what can you tell us about the risk the DA takes in pushing forward with this case, getting the indictment that he had hoped to get? Obviously, we don't know what the charges are inside that indictment. We knew that this had sat in the DA's office for many years, ramped up, obviously, in these recent months, as we've all reported on, and now the indictment. But the real test comes in actually prosecuting this.
And you're absolutely right, David, that this is a tough case for Alvin Bragg and the DA's office for the reasons that other people have said. This is a novel, very novel theory of criminal liability because you're tying this state crime of falsifying business records with election fraud, essentially. And something to note is the Southern District of New York, my former office, looked at this case and looked at the hush money payments case and took a pass on it. And Alvin Bragg used to be a prosecutor at the Southern District of New York. I worked with him. And now they have taken a second look and they thought that it's good enough to bring. So it's something to ask yourself. It's going to be difficult just by that mere fact that someone else had looked at this and decided maybe not to go forward.
Ken Nowday, thank you so much, Ken. Again, we can't underscore here the challenge that lies ahead, really, on both sides of this case, particularly for the prosecutor in uncharted territory. Ken, thank you. I do want to bring in our other contributors as well. Rick Klein, our political director here. And Rick, the question a lot of people at home are going to ask, and obviously this is something we have never seen before, so we're watching it play out in real time. But there is nothing that says a former president or a candidate, for that matter, who's been criminally charged can't continue to plow forward with a race for president.
That's 100% correct, David. In fact, someone could presumably even campaign from a jail cell if he or she is imprisoned, and certainly in an active investigation, in the middle of a trial. None of that would disqualify Donald Trump from running for office. So he could pursue that as he says he would. And there's a conventional wisdom that's been developing in Republican circles that this indictment might help him politically because it feels like he's being targeted all over again. But I'll tell you, in talking to campaigns in waiting on the Republican side, there's a lot of questioning around that notion. A lot of people on the Republican side who will say, yes, this prosecution may be politically motivated, but may also begin to make the case that all the weariness around Donald Trump, enough is enough. And that just this adding to the sense and the whiff of scandal around him, this comes at a very interesting point in the developing 2024 race. A lot of candidates still on the sidelines, including major challengers like Governor Ron DeSantis. But people like DeSantis have said, look, I'm not going to talk about this, and I do think it may be politically motivated, but I want people to recognize that all of this is about hush money to porn stars. Just a little reminder of what's at the root of this and what could be a political liability down the road as this campaign develops.
All right, Rick Klein, our political director. Rick, thank you. Perhaps one of the first reactions from the former president himself is just into ABC News. John Santucci, what has the former president told you?
David, I just hung up with the former president. He tells me that he just learned of the news, said it's an attack on our country, said it's political persecution. He went on to say, David, they are trying to impact an election. I asked the former president, does he plan to turn himself in? David, he said, you take care, John, and then he hung up on me. So I think we're going to have to wait and see. But obviously, all of our reporting has been that the former president does indeed intend to head to New York. Maybe didn't want to give me that piece of information just yet from him, but something that we know his team has been in active conversations right now with the Secret Service of what that is going to look like.
All right, John Santucci, our thanks for your reporting. Again, the former president Donald Trump telling John just moments ago they are trying to impact an election. As the former president now runs for the White House again, unclear again when he will come to surrender to the charges. Here in New York City, a Manhattan grand jury voting to indict the former president just a short time ago Breaking the news right here. He will be criminally charged. Of course, the first time we have seen this play out in our country before. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live. Of course, the entire team, as you have seen right here, working hard to report this out. We'll have team coverage on World News Tonight just about 21 minutes from now. In the meantime, we turn to your local news, and I'll see you shortly. Until then, good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.